Welcome to the Corporate Director Podcast, where we discuss the experiences and ideas behind what's working in corporate board governance in our digital tech-fueled world. Here, you'll discover new insights from corporate leaders and governance researchers with compelling stories about corporate governance, strategy, board culture, risk management, digital transformation, and more.
Hello, and welcome back to the Corporate Director Podcast, the voice of modern governance. My name is Meghan Day, strategy leader at Diligent, and I'm joined today by Kira Ciccarelli, senior researcher for the Diligent Institute. Kira, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me. Happy to still be pinch hitting for Dottie before she gets back from APAC.
I'm excited that we have another special guest with us on the show, Josh Black, editor-in-chief of Diligent Market Intelligence. Josh, welcome back to the show yourself.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Well, today's episode is really all about what boards need to have their pulse on as we head into yet another fast-moving proxy season. I feel like proxy season never has an off switch anymore. Josh, you probably feel this too. It is like a year-round thing now with activism, compensation, crazy regulations, all colliding in some pretty interesting ways. So, Josh, we are really excited to have you back to talk a little bit through what you're seeing in the world of diligent market intelligence. Care to give us a little bit of an update?
Yeah, no, it's been a very busy and exciting few weeks. We've had 3 conferences in 3 weeks, starting with our stewardship series, which gathers institutional investors, corporate advisors, and issuers to talk about the latest and greatest issues that we think will be prominent during proxy season, compensation chief among them. Regulation is obviously changing the tenor of engagement between investors and issuers. We'll let you in on something not so secret. We launched our stewardship intelligence feed at the conference 3 weeks ago. So this is a structured data feed covering compensation, governance, and shareholder insights that allows asset managers to benchmark their voting policies against a global portfolio of companies and action those insights much, much faster than if they were relying on the traditional proxy voting advisors.
Very cool. I want to talk a little bit, Josh, too, about your shareholder activism annual review, which takes a deep dive into what actually happened last year in all things shareholder activism. I think my big takeaway is that volume may have cooled a little bit in some spots, but impact didn't. Boards saw record numbers of seats change hands, and activists appear to be deploying their influence in more targeted ways. What are some big headlines for you for our listeners to keep in mind?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think there may be fewer and possibly more winnable proxy fights from the issuer perspective, but activism is still very painful. So there's CEO turnover. We had 49 CEOs depart US companies within a year of an activist campaign last year. We saw activists make inroads well after a fight with formal or informal settlements the following year. And obviously, analysts and media followings can kind of become fixated on issues that activists raise and become more critical. So we're seeing a lot of volatility in the markets. This is kind of a year-over-year phenomenon now. No longer an excuse for issuers to kind of plead that the markets are running away from them. I think directors need to be cognizant that investors are looking for a long-term plan that is, fully vetted and has the right management and board composition to execute against it. Even if the market is moving very fast, companies need to stay ahead of the curve. And then, one of the things that is going to be most impactful from the activist perspective from the tail end of last year going into this proxy season is M&A. That's driving a lot of activist activity. Push for sale activism was up 29% year on year and has almost doubled since 2021. Opposition to deals is also up sharply and is very, very disruptive to a company's strategy. So it's going to be a very interesting proxy season, potentially a lot of activity, and we wait to see where it goes.
One of the things that stuck out to me, and I think you started to allude to it a little bit there, is this idea that activism is shifting away from traditional all-out proxy fights and more towards things like settlements, withhold campaigns, and pressure around specific issues. You mentioned M&A. As you kind of look ahead, how would you characterize the mood? Do you care to make any predictions?
Yeah, it's a really interesting time because with the regulatory changes, particularly with the SEC kind of changing the definition of the 13D rules, investors are giving less and less away to companies, and this puts boards at a bit of a disadvantage if they can't read the tea leaves, they don't understand how their largest investors feel about their strategy. And so that is forcing them to, I think, communicate very clearly, to be proactive in the issues that they want to raise with their investors, even to bring up things that they think might be controversial before they're asked about. I think activists are looking to portray disruption and operational or stock price challenges at companies as all connected to the boardroom. And so there is an increased amount of rhetoric among activist investors about compensation and misalignment of incentives. Activists, I think, are trying to portray compensation as part of a larger problem. And so we're seeing a lot of activism aimed at operational management and structural changes kind of all coming together at the same time, and that lends itself to strategies that are not necessarily dependent on proxy season and director nominations. So there are withhold campaigns, there are PR campaigns, M&A, another one that can kind of happen at any time of the year. So to your point, very much a year-round phenomenon now, not a defined proxy season.
One of the most striking data points in the report is how often exec pay now serves as an entry point for some of these broader activist demands. Josh, any commentary there on what you're seeing in the world of compensation?
Yeah, so compensation broadly is a fairly good news story for companies. The rates of say on pay, opposition, and failures is down to fairly low levels. But I think there's still a lot of scrutiny. I think going into this year, we're going to see a lot of scrutiny of perquisites. We're going to see a lot of scrutiny around equity issuances. And you know, while the stock market did okay last year, and pay is obviously a backward-looking indicator, it never helps to go into a say on pay vote if your stock price is down. So it's going to be a challenging proxy fight. It's going to be a challenging proxy season for some companies. The fact that activist investors are talking about compensation more freely, targeting nomination committee members with withhold votes in some instances, certainly doesn't help matters.
Well, along those same lines, I was just reading an article that corporate jet usage is up among CEOs. So always another fun topic headed into proxy season as well when we start to talk about those additional perks. But I do think, in all seriousness, this is a perfect bridge for our interview that we have today. We are joined by Caroline Montalbano, partner at Meridian Compensation Partners, to talk about what boards and comp committees should expect from a potential new SEC executive compensation disclosure ruling and how to prepare now before those rules are finalized. So, Josh, thank you for joining us today and setting the table. Let's give this interview with Caroline a listen. Joining us on the Corporate Director podcast today is Caroline Montalbano, partner at Meridian Compensation Partners, one of the most respected advisory firms working with boards and compensation committees on executive pay, incentive design, and governance. Caroline, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Megan. I'm thrilled to be here.
Well, let's start off by having you give us a little bit more about your background. How did you find your way into the exec comp and governance space, and how do you spend your time now with boards and comp committees?
Yeah, I'm happy to share that. So, my journey to executive compensation is perhaps a bit unique. I actually started my career in public accounting as a CPA, and then I transitioned to the corporate world where I held a variety of finance and HR leadership roles before joining Meridian in 2020. And now at Meridian, most of my work involves helping companies design incentive programs that align with long term performance and, importantly, stand up to investor and regulatory scrutiny. So, as part of that, I also help boards think about how they're going to communicate these decisions in the proxy statement, most specifically, how they're going to tell the pay for performance story.
So, sitting at the intersection of board decision making, investor expectations, evolving SEC rules, you are the perfect person to help us unpack what's coming next on executive compensation disclosure and what boards should be doing to stay ahead. So, let's dive in. There's been a lot of activity, starts and stops, shifting priorities at the SEC. Many expect that new proxy disclosure rules related to exec comp could be the most material item on the SEC's 2026 agenda. From your vantage point, what do you expect those rules to focus on? And why do you see executive compensation disclosure as both a top SEC priority and one of the most consequential areas for boards and comp committees right now?
It's a great question. And it's certainly something we're watching closely here because, as you said, Megan, we expect that one of the most significant items on the SEC's agenda right now is going to be this potential modernization of executive compensation disclosure rules. And something I find interesting, much of the current framework actually dates back to the major proxy disclosure overhaul that the SEC adopted in 2006. So we're kind of 20 years old now with these rules. And since then, we've seen additional requirements that have been layered on, like the CEO pay ratio, like the pay versus performance disclosures. But the result is that really at this point, proxy disclosures have become extremely long. They contain disclosures that, frankly, investors and filers don't see a lot of value including. So, to kick off the review of the framework, actually last year, the SEC hosted a roundtable on executive compensation disclosure requirements, and they invited participation from public companies, investors, industry groups, advisors, and really sought their feedback on the overall utility and effectiveness of executive compensation disclosures. And now, most recently, as we think about areas that may be subject to change, the SEC has signaled that they're taking a broader look, really, at whether the existing framework is still achieving its core goal, which should be helping investors understand how and why boards make compensation decisions. And we expect really that this review could lead to some of the most meaningful changes to executive compensation disclosure in nearly 2 decades, which is incredibly exciting.
Yeah, so let's talk about what that could actually mean in practice. How do you expect potential new rules to change the way companies structure their compensation discussion and analysis and tell that pay for performance story?
So, areas of simplification that we may anticipate could be number one, reducing the number of executive officers that would be included in compensation disclosures. Another area of simplification is just going to be simplifying overall disclosure requirements, such as, again, the PVP table. I think our ultimate goal here and what at the end of the day, boards will be focused on in this new disclosure regime will be disclosures that help investors understand their decision making process and move away from sort of a compliance focused, detailed inventory of compensation elements.
So, even before new rules are finalized, there's still some things that boards should be thinking about potentially. Whether that's around plan design, peer groups, if the SEC does propose this. So, what should organizations be thinking about right now related to this?
Yeah, this is a great time to really do a couple of things. One, this is a great time for organizations to review their current CD&A through the lens of clarity. So, does it clearly connect strategy, performance goals, and pay outcomes? Second, we want to make sure that the documentation behind compensation decisions is strong, especially when we're touching upon those topics that you named, Megan, such as metric selection, goal setting, use of discretion, peer group definition, describing pay outcomes, and certainly special awards. I think a good rule to keep in mind here is that if a compensation decision is hard to explain, it will probably be hard to disclose. And then third, as always, a sort of a best practice against this backdrop is regularly evaluate your compensation plan design to ensure that it remains aligned with the organization's long-term strategy and most importantly, that it can be clearly explained to investors.
Makes sense. What are some other items on the SEC's agenda that you're watching, and which types of companies will be most affected by those changes?
So For sure, executive compensation disclosure may be a headline item, but it is part of a broader reconsideration of how public company disclosures work. So, one area that we're watching is the SEC's broader review of corporate disclosure requirements across Regulation SK. What the Commission has signaled is that they are interested in modernizing the overall disclosure framework, particularly given consideration to just what's accumulated over time. So, this could include things like simplifying our governance disclosures, revisiting how companies describe risk factors and human capital management, and generally focusing on disclosures that are most useful to investors. Another area is the evolving framework for shareholder proposals, which can affect which proposals make it on to the proxy ballot. And then, as you mentioned, there are a few initiatives that affect specific groups of companies. So, for example, the SEC has been looking at bringing officers and directors of foreign private issuers into the Section 16A insider reporting framework. The consequence of this is that we would see an obligation to file Form 3s and Form 4s for our foreign private issuers, and they've not had to do that previously. And then there are also ongoing efforts around capital formation, things like updates to emerging growth company accommodations and private market rules. Those will meaningfully affect companies that are considering going public.
So, stepping back and pulling this all together, what are your top two or three concrete actions you'd recommend comp committees take now to stay ahead of these SEC developments and investor scrutiny in general?
Yeah, there's probably two that I would flag right off the bat. One is, and it's a key theme that we've discussed so far, really ensure that the company's pay for performance narrative is clear and defensible. Because we know that what investors and regulators are seeking is an understanding of how performance outcomes translate into compensation outcomes. The second thing that I would recommend is, against the backdrop of these potential changes, stay proactive in your shareholder engagement. Many companies are going to learn the most about investor expectations, perhaps about where they're not meeting the mark or where their disclosures are unclear, through direct conversations with their major shareholders. So that's definitely something to keep up during this transition period.
So, putting your crystal ball in front of you, where do you see SEC and investor expectations heading next on exec comp and governance beyond this current wave of rulemakings and withdrawals? And maybe to add on that, what should boards be scenario planning for the next several years?
I think really the direction of travel here is going to be towards greater transparency and stronger alignment with long term value creation as we think about overall executive compensation. We know that investors expect boards to demonstrate that executive pay is tied to meaningful performance outcomes and that overall compensation programs support the company's strategy. So, really, the steer here for boards is just to continue emphasizing clear disclosures, greater explanation of any board judgment in what they're putting forward to describe their pay for performance story.
Caroline, very helpful, timely conversation, and I very much appreciate your practical guidance for our listeners. Before we wrap up, we have a couple of questions that we like to ask all of our guests. The first is, what do you think will be the biggest difference between boardrooms today and 10 years from now?
This is a great one. I think that one of the biggest differences we may see in boardrooms 10 years from now will be the amount of data directors have access to. I think in my experience sitting in boardrooms, boards have heavily relied on information from management, periodic benchmarking reports. But as we see these data tools become more sophisticated, I think that boards are going to have much more direct access to market data, to benchmarking comparisons and performance analytics. And so the expectation, I think, would be that this will allow directors to make more informed comparisons and better strategic decisions. And interestingly, I think the other real benefit here is that it may actually free up time in the boardroom. So instead of spending meetings chasing data or asking for follow up analysis, boards can focus more of their time on the strategic questions that really matter.
Love that. What was the last thing you read, watched, or listened to that made you think about governance in a new light?
So, this is actually an episode of the Corporate Director podcast, the recent one about board governance in the AI age. I find the influence and potential role of AI fascinating as a personal user, as a professional user, and then now as we think about AI in the boardroom. I think one of the points that stuck with me was that directors don't necessarily need to be AI experts, but they do need a basic level of AI literacy to oversee strategy and oversee risk. And it just really reinforced the idea that AI is becoming a governance issue that touches strategy, it touches reporting, it touches risk management, but now it's starting to extend to directors in the boardroom.
Lastly, Caroline, what is your current passion project?
Outside of work, my passion project is honestly travel planning for my family. I love researching destinations. I love figuring out how to build trips around experiences that we can enjoy together, whether it's food, culture, history, hiking. I love it all. It brings us closer together as a family. It gives us some great stories, and it helps us to make some new friendships and some new connections along the way.
I love that. Where are you headed to next?
So we actually just finished one of our big trips. We are friends with a family who live in Australia. We met them in New Zealand. And so the two families traveled through New Zealand together. It was incredible.
Oh, very cool. Well, Caroline, thank you so much again for joining us on the show.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Thanks for that great interview, Megan. My head always spins whenever I listen to any of the interviews from Meridian Compensation Partners because the world of compensation is so complex. But huge props to Caroline for explaining it in such a clear way and talking about some of the trends that we might see moving forward. One thing that I wanted to comment on quickly was her answer to one of the questions that we ask all of our guests at the end of the show about what Caroline thinks the biggest difference will be between boardrooms today and 10 years from now. This has been my favorite question to ask everybody for a long time, but I think one of the newer trends that we're starting to see, and Caroline pointed it out, was to comment on this idea that directors are going to have access to more and more data over time and how they kind of rely on what they're getting from management and how sort of the expansion of the scope there is going to allow directors to make more informed comparisons. It reminds me of some of the stats that we're getting out of the Director Confidence Index, which is our quarterly pulse survey that we do with corporate board member. We asked some questions about how boards are overseeing enterprise risk and the things that they're commenting on that they want more access to, they want more data, they want more updates from management, and they want kind of better benchmarking data. And I think they are starting to think more about how they can use AI-powered tools and dashboards to sort of wrap their arms around all of that. So definitely something that I think we're hearing across the board from directors these days.
Yeah, really interesting too. It makes me even think about her comment through the lens of executive compensation. If you're a comp committee chair and you now have access to minute details of, not just your peer group, but like every company in the world, what they're doing for executive compensation, and that's being able to be boiled up to you in a really succinct and understandable way, and then married that with how investors are thinking about some of those particular issues or comp plans that are out there, you really don't have any excuse to now not have your story straight, if that makes sense. That so much of that narrative that Caroline talks about is going to become increasingly important if you start to sort of deviate from what the norm is, if you will. And so that's going to be really interesting to see if there's some normalization that starts to really rear its head amongst exec comp and who those outliers are and how they might respond to investors probing a little bit deeper into the why.
Yeah, I feel like this is the story of AI, right? Like, and not just at the board level and not just with exec comp. It's like the story of the other shoe dropping. Like, you can do so much more and you can learn so much more and you have access to so much more. But then how does that change
Yeah.
the expectation?
Yeah. Well, great food for thought as always. That wraps up another episode of the Corporate Director Podcast, the voice of modern governance. A couple of special thank yous. First to our exec comp expert, Caroline Montalbano, podcast producers, Kira Ciccarelli, Steve Clayton, and Laura Klein. Our sponsors, KPMG, Wilson Sonsini, and Meridian Compensation Partners, and most especially to Diligent. If you like our show, be sure to give us a rating on your podcast player of choice. You can also listen to episodes and see more from Diligent Institute by going to diligent.com/resources. And if you also serve on a nonprofit or public sector board, then tune in to our sister Diligent podcast, Leading with Purpose, for expert conversations on governance, risk, and compliance that makes an impact for mission-driven organizations. Thanks so much for listening.
You've been listening to the Corporate Director Podcast. To ensure that you never miss an episode, subscribe to the show in your favorite podcast player. If you'd like to learn more about corporate governance and tools to help directors do their job better, visit www.diligent.com. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.